I mean, I'm aware of this, but every once in a while I pause along the road and just kind of take a look at the scenery. And some of it is, it looks pretty until you look closer at it, and then you go, ooh, that's not an apple tree at all, so to speak. Yeah, let's go into some of the symbols.
Well, as Vigilant Citizen and many other researchers have pointed out, there are various little clues and symbols that they put into videos of these artists. Nicki Minaj is always a good example to start with, because she actually has alters and different personalities which she brings into interviews. There's no attempt to even hide it. And one of the personalities that she slips into quite often, or has done over the years, is this character which she calls Roman Zelensky. And it's wordplay on the Polish film director that was exposed as a paedophile a few years ago, Roman Polanski. It's a surprise, isn't it? Director of Rosemary's Baby, Chinatown, and a whole bunch of other movies. And his wife, Sharon Tate, was one of the victims of the Manson family murders in California in 1969. Lots of synchronistic connections between Roman Polanski and various names in Hollywood and the Beatles, when you get down to it as well. But Nicki Minaj has got this character known as Roman Zelensky, and she says it's a gay male. And whenever she slips into Roman mode, her voice changes and her personality changes. And she put out a track a few years ago on one of her albums called Roman's Revenge. And there's lyrical clues in that, such as, take your medication, Roman, you'll be okay, Roman, you just need a little break, Roman, and all this sort of stuff. And she did a duet with Eminem as well, where she resurrected this Roman Zelensky character. And she'll go into it in interviews, as I say. And a few years ago, she stated that she was no longer going to be this Roman Zelensky character, and that he'd been exorcised from her, which is a very interesting turn of phrase, I feel. But she's also got this other alternative personality that she goes into, and it's where she affects a British accent, like a London society girl. I've heard her in interviews. She'll be talking with a sort of New York twang, and then she'll decide that she wants to be this British girl, and so her voice will change, and she sounds like she's from London. And people hearing it think it's hilarious. They think it's great. They think she's so quirky and kooky and talented that she can do all these different voices, you know. And they have no idea what's actually going on beneath the surface. And what would appear to be going on is that she's switched into one of these alternative personalities that she's got locked away in her mind. For some reason it's been triggered, and she's slipped into that altar. And she's not the only artist that does this British girl accent. I've heard Mariah Carey in interviews slip into exactly the same kind of London society girl accent. And Britney Spears does the same thing. And on the track Scream and Shout, which is a big #1 hit featuring will.i.am, lots to say about him as well, on the hook of the track, she actually performs it using this London accent. And Scream and Shout, incidentally, the track, I would suggest is an example of them rubbing your face right in it, because the hook line goes, we're going to scream and shout and let it all out. And it almost seems to be them mocking the fact that they've got these mind control victims, and they're puppeteering them on this record and getting them to do whatever they're told. And they can scream and shout and try and let it all out, but nobody really understands what's going on in their mind. So isn't it interesting that you've got Britney Spears, Mariah Carey and Nicki Minaj all doing this British girl accent, and people will put that down to coincidence, but they tend to do that, people.
Isn't that strange?
When they don't want to face the truth.
Wow.
Yeah, and Lady Gaga has got a gay male alter ego as well, which she calls Joe Calderon. And he's like this sort of mafia gangster type character. She puts on a big sort of guy's suit and pads out her shoulders and says that she's now this gay male, which is very reminiscent of Nicki Minaj's Roman Zelensky. You know, what is going on here? Why have so many of these artists got alter egos they slip into? You know, is this all just innocent fun and just one of those things? Or is there something going on here that people need to pay attention to? You know, how much justification and writing off are people going to make for all these strange ways in which artists are behaving Artists never used to do this, but they all do it now. Beyonce has got Sasha Fierce. She's got this alter ego that she slips into. She said in interviews, I become Sasha Fierce. It's like she takes over me, she controls me, and I can do all the things through her that I wouldn't ordinarily do myself. I hide behind the persona. Eminem's got Slim Shady. You know, Jay-Z's got alter egos. They've all got alter egos. And to me, it's subtle hints at the mind control that goes on in the music industry.
Mark, how do you reckon this is done? I mean, do they all get together for little indoctrination sessions? Is it one-on-one at the shrink that's provided by the company they work for, the one that writes their checks? I mean, how do you reckon this is actually carried out practically?
Well, as I said, there are question marks hanging over certain artists, and I can't say for sure one way or the other whether they've been victims of trauma-based mind control or not. I think some artists have the imagery and the symbols inserted into their videos without their knowledge or their approval, just to help kind of further the agenda without necessarily having undergone the processes themselves. But there are other artists where the indications seem pretty clear. And one of the ways that it's done is via Disney, Walt Disney, and particularly the Mickey Mouse Club, which is this sort of talent show offshoot of the Disney Corporation. Britney Spears was a part of the Mickey Mouse Club, as was Justin Timberlake and Christina Aguilera in the same year. There's a famous picture of all of them when they sort of graduated from the Mickey Mouse Club. Disney, as I've touched on before, and probably some of your guests have, is not what it seems. It's a very dark, sinister organisation steeped in Satanism and dark occultic practices. Walt Disney himself is said to have been a Satanist, 33rd degree Freemason, involved in all manner of practices. And the Disney Corporation has been used for many decades for mind control and for various aspects of the satanic agenda that we're seeing play out. And with Britney Spears, it would appear fairly clear that she was manipulated and mind controlled from a very early age, with it in mind that she would always become the big celebrity and the big star that she now is, that she would be put out there into the public eye when she was ready to be completely down with the program that had been set for her. And when you look into the work of researchers like Fritz Springmeier and others that have really gone in on trauma-based mind control, Freeman is another one, they tell you that they get them very young, and the way to completely capture the mind of an individual and the way to cause them to dissociate from reality is to get them when they're a child, when the mind is still forming. And you also hear of it happening through generational bloodlines. They focus on particular genealogy, particular families, and they enforce the mind control through the generations. So you have parents abusing their own children because they themselves were abused and they've been programmed and conditioned to do that. That's all they know. And so it gets passed on through the generations. So there's a lot of importance placed on the bloodlines that are involved in this. Just staying with Disney, another great example of a mind-controlled artist I would suggest is Miley Cyrus. Quite a topical recent one. We've all seen the footage of her at the VMA Awards, I think it was, where she was coming out in her slutty sort of, pornographic gear and performing what was basically a sex show live on stage in front of families and kids. And Robin Thicke came out in his black and white mind control trigger Masonic coat suit and performed this duet with her. Robin Thicke is another example of an artist gone bad, I would suggest, similar to what was done with Kanye West. He started out as a credible, soulful sort of artist that had a bit of integrity and was making decent music, and now he's been completely corrupted and sent down the same path as all the others. And that stage show with Miley Cyrus was part of his initiation into that way of things, I would suggest. So
that was really a disgusting display.
well, really,
I didn't think there was anything sexy about it. I thought it was crude, base, rank, and totally not sexy. Perverse, yes. Sexy, no.
She was filleting a blow-up doll. And, one of the things that people say to you when you point this stuff out is, oh, you're just a prude, you're a fuddy-duddy, get with the program, what's the matter with you? You're just being a stick in the mud. And a few years ago, I might have felt the same way. But let's look at what we're doing here. We're highlighting the morality, or the lack of it, of performers on stage in a show that is watched by children, simulating fellatio and God knows what else. Young kids watch these artists. What is the target audience of Miley Cyrus? It's mainly young girls. Anything from age 6 to probably 15, 16, I would suggest. Yep. Who is going to argue that it's just a bit of fun and it's innocent and it's nothing to get upset about when you've got 6-year-old girls watching this kind of behaviour on stage? This is basic morality, it's common sense, and it's called being an adult. It's called being grown up, being mature. This is a mature outlook. This kind of behaviour should not be tolerated, and people should not be buying into this and supporting these artists because they are being manipulated and they're being puppeteered, and there's an agenda here to mind control the masses. Never mind the artists themselves being mind controlled. They are mind controlled so that they in turn can mind control the people that lap them all up. So Miley Cyrus also came out of Disney. She was Hannah Montana, part of the Disney Corporation. What a coincidence. Big part of the agenda is Disney.
How do you reckon Radio Disney stays on the air?
Well, well connected, I would suggest.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Friends in high places.
Yeah, and I've come across that station a couple of times and just thought, I wonder what the little kiddies are listening to. And I'm not going to say that I was creeped out, but it got my attention. This is odd programming. Now we're going to go and tour, in my room, we're going to go up to somebody's room and take a tour and this and that, and all these ridiculous activities and this music. I mean, really, some of the beats and the friendly chord progressions are they're appealing. But when you listen to this and you think, wow, I wonder what a steady dose of this channel would really do to your head after a while. Some real questions come to mind.
And also in the Disney logo, you've got the 666 hidden in the graphics. If you notice, every time you see a Disney cartoon or a piece of Disney merchandise, it's always the same logo, that sort of handwritten logo saying Disney. They never use any other font or any other graphic. And many researchers have highlighted that there's a 666 cleverly hidden in the graphics. That's why they're putting that in your face and drumming it into your subliminal mind all the time. You have 666, the number of the beast in the book of Revelation, and so many other connotations. And one of the other hand signals, which I forgot to mention earlier, alongside the supposed I love you one, is the this one, which you see all the time, which is supposed to mean everything's okay, it's fine, it's great. But I would suggest that there could be an ulterior motive at work here as well, and there's an alternative interpretation of this. It is actually a 6, and what you're doing is making a 6 with your fingers, and you have the 3 fingers held up there at the top, which is indicating 6 to the power of 3, or 3 sixes, hence 666. And if people think that's reaching, or it's just a coincidence, or it's just finding something that you want to find for the sake of it, have a look at the vast number of artists that you see holding up this sign as well, in promotional shots and record sleeves and all of that. It goes hand in hand with the one eye, it goes hand in hand with the horned hand, and it goes hand in hand with all these other symbols that we see. Vast numbers of artists doing it. Politicians and world leaders doing it too. Yeah, so they're all going okay. Yeah, that's what they're all doing, and it's just a big coincidence. Okay.
Yeah, we just saw a picture with Lennon's got his little finger and his index finger up making the horns, and Paul's making the chippo.
Yes. The
all correct sign, the 666, whatever.
On the cover of Yellow Submarine. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's get into Beatles then. You know, I was watching the Ruttles the other day, which was just clearly a parody on everything that they were doing. And some of the music was actually pretty good, you know, but even the sound of Ringo's drums, that little flat yet crisp snare sound, was cleverly reproduced. But, you know, all this thing about, you know, John going on talking about how, you know, it's nothing but peace and he's not about war. I mean, he and Yoko did a bed in, but the Ruttles did a shower in. They're sitting there in the shower. Then his girlfriend's got this Nazi armband on. It was just amazing. I mean, I haven't laughed that hard in a long time because back when they came out, it's like, you're mocking the Beatles and we're serious about the Beatles and you guys are just asses, okay? But no, actually, they were very clever. So what about the Beatles and Mark David Chapman and the you know, people have said that he might be an MK Ultra graduate and that and you know, they kept refusing Lennon's immigration and all of this and you know, as people get closer to it now, they're saying, well, he was abusive and he was mean and he was a bad guy and he was just a terrible person and all this. I don't know. I didn't hang out with the guy. So I don't know. I mean, I really do believe half of what I see and virtually nothing of what I hear.
Yeah.
So take it away. Let's get into Beatledom a little bit here.
So much to talk about with the Beatles. I'm writing this book at the moment. I've done 2 chapters on the Beatles, and they're big chapters, like 12,000 words apiece. So it's like a quarter the size of the average book is just about the Beatles, because you start digging into their story, and you just discover more and more information, and you go off in more and more different directions, and it's fascinating and intriguing throughout. And before you know it, you've opened up a whole different can of worms. So there is so much to say. And one of the first things about them is their creation in the first place. Many researchers have suggested that they were actually a creation of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, which is an organisation steeped in mind control and social engineering in many different ways. There's an ex-British intelligence operative by the name of John Coleman that has put forward the suggestion that the Beatles were a creation of this particular think tank. And
is he alive, Mark? Is Coleman alive?
I believe he's no longer alive.
Didn't he write the book, The 300?
Yes, he did. That's the guy.
Well, no wonder if he's deceased, no wonder we can't reach him.
Yeah.
Anyway, carry on, sorry.
Yes, you don't tend to live too long when you start talking about these things. But anyway, there's also a guy by the name of Theo Adorno who was linked to the Frankfurt School. And the Frankfurt School is very much an equivalent of the Tavistock Institute there in Germany. And Coleman has said that this guy Theo Adorno was given the Beatles as a kind of pet project to set them up as a group, to write many of the lyrics to their songs, and to dictate the direction that they would go in, and you know, the program that they would carry out. I don't know if there's truth to that or not. With so many of these things, it's unclear one way or the other what the truth is. But I feel it's worth taking these things on board and reflecting on them either way. So that's a suggestion with regard to how the Beatles were actually formed. The idea that they weren't this natural, organic group, this bunch of musicians that knew each other at school and decided to put a group together. They may well have started that way and then got co-opted very early on. Again, I can't say whether that's the truth or not. You also have an author by the name of Joseph Niezgoda, and he put out, I think he was an attorney, and he went down this sort of sideline hobby thing as an author, and he put out a book called The Lennon Prophecies a few years ago. And in that, he puts forward the suggestion that the Beatles in 1960 were made an offer they couldn't refuse, so to speak, by the forces that control the industry, and they were promised great fame and fortune, and that they would be the most famous group in the world if they would effectively sell their soul and do what is required of anyone that makes it rich and famous. And Niezgoda claims that John Lennon made a deal along these lines, and that the deal was made in December 1960. And he says that there was a point towards the end of December 1960 in a concert in England where, for the first time, you had girls screaming at the Beatles and trying to mob them on stage, and all the hysteria and the Beatlemania that everyone's so familiar with started in that one particular night. The suggestion being that that was all set up and manipulated, and that when other fans saw all these girls screaming for the Beatles, it just kind of caught on and became infectious and took on a life of its own. So he claims this deal was struck by Lennon in December 1960. And he claims that the deal wasn't a lifetime one, it came with a shelf life of 20 years, which means it expired in December 1980. And in December 1980, John Lennon just happened to be murdered by Mark David Chapman, we're told. Although, when you get into that, you also uncover the suggestion that Chapman may not have actually killed Lennon. He was almost certainly an MK-Ultra mind control victim. Manchurian Candidate assassin style, classic example. But there are, again, many sources which state that the real murderer of Lennon was a CIA operative that was posing as the doorman on the Dakota building on that night by the name of Jose Padermo. And the claim is that Padermo, when there was a distraction going on and it was all eyes on Chapman, because Chapman apparently got down into a marksman's pose and assumed the position and appeared to fire the shots at Lennon. And the claim is that Paderno was actually the guy that killed Lennon, and Chapman was left to take the rap for it. Very similar to what happened with Sirhan Sirhan and the murder of Robert Kennedy. There's similar claims there as well. So that's one claim about the Beatles. There are many others. As you've pointed out, there's lots of symbolism in their record sleeves, such as on Yellow Submarine, you've got Paul McCartney doing the 6 sign and Lennon doing the horned hand. Then you have the famous sleeve to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, where they've got an array of characters who they said at the time were our heroes. We wanted to put our heroes on the sleeve. In amongst them is Aleister Crowley, the aforementioned dark occultist, and there's many other satanic sort of figures and eugenicists and establishment stooges and stuff in that lineup as well. So that's quite an interesting thing. And this is all before you get into the suggestion that Paul McCartney might not be the fellow we think he is. And that really is a whole different rabbit hole to go down, the Paul is dead theory. I don't even know if we've got time for that, because you could talk about that for hours.
Some people have even said that McCartney was replaced long ago.
Exactly. This is.
I mean, do you think that that's true in any way, Mark? Is that I'm sure it's possible. We know that Saddam Hussein and every other world leader that gets much attention has stand-ins, doppelgangers.
Well, it sounds ridiculous when you first hear it, and there's a lot of denial among Beatles fans as to not just the Paul is dead theory, but just the whole idea that the Beatles were in some way created, and they didn't form the way we're told they did, and they were used and manipulated. A lot of denial, particularly among original generation Beatles fans, because to admit that a group that you loved and you followed for many years, that coloured your nostalgic youth and summed up your life when you were young, could have been manipulated and controlled is just too much for people to go with. So there's a lot of heavy denial. People don't want to hear it. They want to remember the Beatles the way they remain in their mind. I mentioned this to an old colleague of mine who's about 21 years older than me, and he remembers the Beatles when they were around in the 60s. And when I first started getting into all this research, I emailed him. He's an old editor of mine from one of my magazines that I worked on. And I said, what do you think about all this stuff? Have you looked into this? And his reply was, I prefer the 60s as I remember them. And that is the mentality of a lot of people. They don't want to have to rewrite history in their mind. They don't want to have to admit that they were duped and taken in and all is not as it seems. They want to remember it the way they prefer. And I can understand that, because I went through a similar process with the Jay-Z thing, coming to acknowledge that Jay-Z was a stooge and not this amazing lyricist that I'd always imagined him to be. So there is a lot of denial there, but regarding the Paul is dead theory, I can't say for certain, one way or the other, whether the real Paul McCartney was replaced in 1966 as it is claimed. But it remains possible. Sounds ridiculous when you first hear the suggestion. When you do the research, when you get into the true nature of this business, when you understand that ritual sacrifices go on, when you understand that mind control of artists goes on, and when you understand that this control system loves to place little clues and little indicators of what they're doing right there in public sight, it suddenly becomes a possibility. And it becomes something that anyone with an open mind and without a belief system to defend needs to look into. Even if you come to no definitive answer, one way or the other, it remains a possibility, and it's something for truth-seeking individuals to look at.
Yeah. You know, Mark, oh, there it's gone now. You know, some have even floated out the theory that McCartney, now known as we're getting some really strange interference. Everybody get that? I was actually replaced by Angela Lansbury. I'm not sure I buy into that one. Let me ask you something about the Yesterday and Today album. What do you make of all those dismembered babies, baby dolls with meat lying all around and on and over the shoulders of the grinning Beatles?
Yeah, very dark sleeve that. Not one that makes anyone feel good that sees it. This was the American version of an album called Yesterday, Today, and it came out in early 1966, so this is before the alleged replacement of McCartney took place, because that's supposed to have happened on the 9th of November 66. And here in the UK, we express our dates. The 9th of November would be expressed 9/11, rather than the American style, which would have been 11/9, November 9th. We would say 9th of November, which is 9/11/66. So you've got an interesting array of figures there for the date where McCartney is supposed to have been replaced. But earlier on in 1966, you had this album, Yesterday, Today, and it was a sort of compendium of previous Beatles tracks, which had been assembled by the record label, Capitol, and put into a different order and put out on this American release. It was never released in Britain. And on the cover, you've got the Beatles in butcher's smocks, covered in raw meat and with mutilated dolls with missing limbs.
What's supposed to be funny about this? What's amusing about this?
Well, some people have said it's avant-garde art. Some people have said it's irony. Don't get it myself. To me, it's a deeply unsettling sleeve. And there are different interpretations that have been put on it. Some people have suggested that the Beatles were well aware of the paedophilia and the child sacrifice that unfortunately goes on in the upper echelons of society, of the establishment. This happens within, the Bohemian Grove type circles, not necessarily at that event, but with the types of characters that would attend these events. There has long been a very strong suggestion that child sacrifice and these kind of activities take place, and so some have said that the Beatles were well aware of this, and they were trying to subtly convey this aspect of the elites to anyone that was able to see through the symbolism. Not sure if that's the case or not. Another more innocent cover story for it was that the idea of this butchered meat and these dolls being cut up was symbolic of how the Beatles felt about their albums being taken and being butchered and cut up, and tracks being taken from here and there and being put onto this compendium without their approval. It was their way of saying, stop butchering our albums, stop taking bits and pieces from them. Again, not sure if that one has any credibility to it. But those seem to be the two popular theories, one of them very dark and the other one quite innocent. There could be other theories as well. But either way, there was a lot of uproar about this sleeve, quite understandably, and it was withdrawn after a few weeks and replaced with a completely different design. So it remains a very rare item that was only around for a short period.
Yeah, I have one, actually. You know, Mark, it's easy for people to get into this stuff. Oh, look, he's dropped a cigarette butt from his left hand while making the chippo. It's a 666 cigarette butt on the drop on the sidewalk. It portends something monstrous, but not really. You know, so it's easy to get pulled into these things if you're inclined to. But I have to tell you that having lived through that, being in elementary school when the Beatles first hit the stage, the American stage, that entire decade, just for myself, it just felt like something very odd was going on. It was almost like the atmosphere itself was just permeated with something with an alternate reality. And that's really the only way to put it. I'm not trying to embellish something and just, let's do some verbal showmanship here. It's true. And I'm sure many people would agree with me. It was like something was happening, but no one was really sure what it was. And there was all this friendly music. I mean, I thought the Beatles' music was largely friendly. I thought Beatles 6 was sort of a dark album with all that Lady Madonna on there and stuff like that. But even that, Lady Madonna, lying on the bed, listen to the music playing in your head, that thing. It was just kind of a decade of what the hell is going on exactly. Something is, for sure, but what is it? And it all kicked off with Kennedy first, and then here came the Beatles after that.
Yeah.
And then deep involvement in the Vietnam War, which went on and on and on and on. It's the damnedest thing, man. It really is.
It was an amazing decade, and particularly the last, or the latter half of it, from 65 onwards, you could say. That's when the real social changes took place. I mean...
And it seemed like it lasted 20 years. It was only 5.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not old enough to remember the 60s. I wasn't around, but I look back on it as far as I'm able, and it seems the second half of the decade was so different to the first. And that's when so many of the changes took place. There's a group that came out of the Laurel Canyon era called Buffalo Springfield. And one of their tracks starts with the lyric, "There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear." And that would appear to be a mantra for that whole era, because the second half of the 60s was, as you say, fascinating. The Beatles' music changed round about 66, and they stopped making these whimsical, pleasant, family-friendly, I love you sort of songs, straight rhythm and blues songs, and they started getting into this experimental psychedelic stuff, as so many of the groups did. You got all the groups that came out of Laurel Canyon at that time in Los Angeles. You got the explosion of acid, LSD, which was completely taken over the minds of young people at that time. You've got the Manson murders that took place in 1969 and all the occult connotations that were connected to that. You've got the Vietnam War, as you say, and all the death and destruction that brought. And in the midst of all of this, you've also got all this talk of the age of Aquarius, which was very big in the latter part of the 60s, from what I can make out.
Yes.
There was this musical in 1968 called Hair, with the classic song Age of Aquarius, and they were talking about the changing times, the end of an astrological age, and the bringing in of a new one, and all the effects that would have on humanity. So you've got this cauldron bubbling away of all these different ingredients, making it a very volatile and very fascinating time period to look at. And the Beatles, of course, were right there in the midst of all of that.
Backwards masking of messages and all this stuff, and then the whole Paul is dead rumor and everything. It was just and it's easy to think, wow, this is just promotional stuff. These are clever lads. Of course. Yeah,
couple of topical things about it as well. The Paul is dead conspiracy theory, which is basically what it is. That's an insulting term, I know, but it is a classic music industry conspiracy theory. It's bubbled away for years. I mean, it first hit the public consciousness in 1969 when there was a caller into Russ Gibbs' radio program in Boston on a university college radio station who first raised the idea that McCartney may have been replaced, and that the Beatles had been placing clues in their music in the form of reverse audio messages and in symbolism on the sleeves and all that sort of thing. So for well over 40 years, there's been this suggestion that McCartney may not be who we think he is. And I first heard about it years ago. And people generally scoff and laugh at it, and it's just written off as one of these crazy conspiracy theories. But within the last few weeks, there was a story that hit the UK headlines here, which suggested that Ringo Starr had raised the subject in an interview recently about Paul McCartney having been replaced, and the fact that he, Ringo, was actually the last surviving original Beatle. And this would appear to have been a spoof story, piece of satire, but it's interesting that it came along, and it's interesting that it raised the whole idea of Paul is dead, of McCartney having been replaced, within the public consciousness again. And I just wonder where that story came from and why it suddenly blew up out of nowhere. And then last week we had the news that Cynthia Lennon, John Lennon's first wife, died of cancer, aged 75. And if there really was a replacement of the original Paul McCartney that took place in 1966, the amount of individuals left in the world alive today that would have been complicit in it is probably down to, single numbers. Count them on two hands. And if the replacement did take place, Cynthia Lennon almost certainly would have had some knowledge of it. So there's another one lost. And you're just conscious of the fact that anyone that was around at the time that may have been a part of this, that would know for sure one way or the other whether this happened, soon they're going to be all gone, including the individual playing the part of McCartney, if indeed that is what we are seeing. Interesting to reflect on that.
Do you know much about Badfinger? It's really interesting. When we were talking, I came across an article entitled "Rock and Roll Suicide: Pete Ham and Tom Evans of Badfinger Can't Take It Anymore." They must have thought they hit the jackpot when the Beatles' Apple Records signed their band in '68, released an album as the Ivies, but by '70 they would be christened Badfinger, and under that moniker they would go on to be the most successful act on the Apple Records roster. But it's like, it says right here, unfortunately, as Badfinger would painfully discover in the record business, so often the people who claim to be your friends are really just vermin waiting for the opportunity to take you for everything you've got. Badfinger's first hit was Paul McCartney's Come and Get It. If there was ever a rock and roll cautionary tale, it is this song. The lyrics now sadly serve as the epitaph for the band's two creative forces, Pete Ham and Tom Evans, both of whom thought killing themselves was the only way to escape the misery caused by the indentured servitude they endured due to a particularly cruel rock and roll contract. If you want it, here it is. Come and get it. Make your mind up fast. If you want it any time, I can get it, but you better hurry because it may not last. It's almost as though the band made a deal with the devil, and the devil was Paul McCartney, who, as the good Beatle, couldn't help but be completely honest when he laid out his Faustian bargain.
Yeah.
Damn. What do you make of that, man?
Well, I know very, very little about Badfinger as a group, but I'm familiar with the scenario that you've outlined there, because this idea of a Faustian sort of deal with the devil, so to speak, although I would suggest it's not a singular entity that people like to call the devil. We're talking about dark forces, dark energetic forces that are represented by these controllers. The Faustian deal is one that's been around for decades, and a depiction of it in the music industry is the deal that the blues musician Robert Johnson is supposed to have made with the so-called devil at the Crossroads, which was the source of his famous song. There's this myth that's been in the music industry for decades that he sold his soul in exchange for great musical talent, and that's how he came to be a famous blues musician. But Robert Johnson died at the age of 27 in some very mysterious circumstances. There's all kinds of accounts of how he died and what the cause was. He's supposed to have been poisoned, according to most accounts, and he was howling like a mad dog, accounts say, just before he died. So not a very happy ending to that particular story. And there's lots of parallels there with so many other musicians that have died at the age of 27. We're talking about the fabled 27 Club here. So many examples of that you can get into.
The fabled 27 Club. Please, let it rock, man. Let it roll. It is.
Well, it's been pointed out that a surprising number of prominent music artists just happen to have died one way or the other at the age of 27.
So it would be Hendrix and Morrison, yeah?
Yep. Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, Robert Johnson that we just mentioned, Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, Amy Winehouse, and a whole bunch of others that I've probably forgotten, but those are the main ones. And so there have been lots of questions raised as to what it is about the age of 27 that appears to be so tragic for so many of these artists. You can get into the individual circumstances surrounding these artists because it varies from name to name. But there's a book which I intend to get into when I jump on a plane for the US in a couple of days by an author called Alex Constantine. And it's called The Covert War Against Rock. And the subtitle is What You Don't Know About the Deaths of. And then he goes into Hendrix, Morrison, Joplin, Lennon, Bob Marley, Brian Jones, and so many others. And he's chapter by chapter, case by case, looking into the strange circumstances surrounding the demise of these iconic artists. I know that Jimi Hendrix, according to most researchers that have looked into it, was killed by his manager, a guy called Michael Jeffrey, who basically drowned him in red wine. He's, pouring bottles of wine down his throat, and basically he drowned on it. So that's one instance. But there are questions and anomalies and discrepancies with all those aforementioned artists in terms of why they died. The suggestion with Janis Joplin is that she stumbled across the truth behind what happened to Hendrix, and she was considered a liability, so she had to go as well. And she just happened to be 27. And this was the same era where Jim Morrison died in 1971, although there are claims that Morrison faked his death and went off somewhere, similar to what's said about Elvis and Tupac. It gets difficult to know what to believe, to be honest. It gets impossible to know what to believe with all these different accounts. But the only thing you can ever be certain of is that the official version of anything is a pack of lies. That's the only thing of which there is ever any certainty. Beyond that, it's open season.
Wow. Now, Brian Jones was 25 when he died. But there have been, let's just depart from the club at 27 for a second. At 25 years old is not very old. And,
I have it that he was 27, actually. He was born 42 and died 69.
No kidding. You know what? I just looked him up. And it said he was 25. That's interesting.
Okay, I think Wikipedia tells you he was 27.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, this was, I think this was Rolling Stone magazine. It might have been. Anyway, I'll look while you talk.
Interesting thing about Brian Jones is that he came from a family background in the British intelligence services. And he was born in Cheltenham. And Cheltenham is the headquarters of GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters. It's basically a spying sort of satellite surveillance operation, similar to the NSA in the United States. And isn't it interesting that his father worked for this establishment? And isn't it interesting that when you look into the family backgrounds of many of the prominent artists of the Laurel Canyon era in the late 60s in California, all these bands that came to symbolize the hippie movement and the counterculture anti-establishment movement, that anti-Vietnam War kind of community that blew up at that time. When you look into the family backgrounds of all these artists, not just some of them, but all of them, this is work that the author Dave McGowan has gone into and exposed in his great book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. All the fathers of these artists, from Jim Morrison to Frank Zappa to the Mamas and the Papas to Buffalo Springfield to Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young and everyone else in between, all come from backgrounds in the military or the intelligence services or some kind of government department. And, you've got that parallel there with Brian Jones in the UK with the GCHQ link. And, of course, the implication here is that maybe all these groups were kind of manufactured and created in some way by think tanks and the various facets of the intelligence services for mind control and social engineering agendas. And maybe they didn't all form and develop the way we're told they did. It's certainly something that's worth musing on. And when you discover that everything else in the world is a lie, then why shouldn't the official story of these groups and where they came from be a lie as well? We've already discussed how you don't just make it to the top through hard work and good luck. There may be elements of that involved, but that alone is not enough to make it big. To make it big, you've got to sign on the dotted line in some way or other. So is it beyond the realms of possibility that even way back in the 60s, there are examples of this going on that we can see?
You're correct, by the way. I just want to, you are, but I just want everybody to know that I know you are. It says right here that this came out, it's rollingstone.com/music/news/Brian-Jones/sympathy for the devil with dashes in between. 19690809 says he's 25 years old. Every other source says exactly what you said.
Yeah.
It's 27.
27. Yeah.
Yeah. So Rolling Stone magazine got it wrong.
Yeah, come on now, guys, fix up.
Seriously, like 24 hours in a day, 24 beers in a case, coincidence? Yeah, it is. But maybe not. I don't know. Well, what's really, a listener the other day asked me, what's the most difficult part of the job? And I didn't read these before. I had a list of them that had been printed off for me, so I was addressing them one at a time and came across this and said, probably the technical aspect of stuff. That's simply not true. If I had thought about it for a little while, I would have said, the most difficult part of this job is to separate the wheat from the chaff, the truth from the Bravo Sierra. That is the most difficult part of the job, because it's easy to run off and start popping off things that are facts, but they're not facts at all. And before long, you turn into somebody who thinks you know, but you don't. You think you know what you're talking about, but you don't. And now you've passed along that fragment of disinformation in most cases onto someone who stopped listening right after, they got this bit of information, and now they've spread it to 10 people. I would say that this technique really is the stock in trade of the deceit masters. Over to you again.
Yeah. If you take something like the Paul is dead story, imagine if you got it wrong. That's why I never stand up there and say Paul McCartney was replaced, because I can't prove that he was. There are suggestions that he was. There's what appears to be pretty good forensic evidence that he was, but I can't prove it. And so I can't stand up there and say 100% definitively this is what happens. It just remains a possibility, maybe even a probability, but you can't confirm it. So imagine if you did go out there publicly and say, this guy that we think of as Paul McCartney today is not the original Paul McCartney. Imagine how hurtful that would be to his family if it simply weren't true. It would be potentially libelous. So you can't get up there and make these statements with any kind of certainty. On the other hand, imagine this scenario did actually take place. Imagine this massive, monumental deception took place nearly 50 years ago, and the original Paul McCartney was taken out, and there's been an imposter playing his part all these years. And imagine if nobody was out there at least putting forward this possibility and getting people to look at it and getting people to think about it and make up their own minds. As I said, in a few years, everyone that was ever involved in it will have gone to their graves, and that secret might be lost forever. And I just think it's worth thinking about the implications of it being lost forever and that truth just never getting out there, if it is truth. As you say, it's so difficult to know what is truth and what is deliberate disinformation and deception, because we know the powers that be put disinformation out there systematically all the time to sow confusion in the minds of those of us that are looking for truth and make us uncertain of what we can believe and what we can't. And then there's misinformation. There's people that just get things wrong. They're not doing it in any malevolent way. They're not trying to deceive and mislead, but they just get things wrong. And if you put all your faith in information that they put out, you're being led up the garden path and, away from truth. So, yeah, it's so difficult, man. And discernment is required. And to a very large extent, I think intuition is required as well. We have intuition as humans, and we have it for a reason. It's gifted to us, and we're supposed to use it, and we're supposed to trust it, and we're supposed to tap into it. And sometimes you get a voice that talks to you in your mind. Not Nicki Minaj. She has different kind of voices in her mind. I'm talking about most people. There's that voice that you can trust, which is the voice of your intuition. And it guides you, and it leads you, and you need to go with that sometimes, because sometimes it's all you've got.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just look, this doesn't take away from the club of 27 whatsoever, but it's interesting that Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls were both 25, and this Rolling Stone article tried to put Brian Jones at 25. So I'm wondering if the new death club is the club of 25 rather than the club of 27. I mean, I'm probably reaching here, but I know that numerologically, the numbers are very important to these freaks who run things. 11s and 7s and 9s and 13s and so forth,
Yeah, they are. It all goes into Kabbalistic numerology and astrotheology and conjunctions of the planets and all this sort of stuff. They're very much into all of this. And as we said before, you yourself may think it's a load of bunkum, but they don't. And it doesn't matter whether you think it's nonsense or not, because they go with it, and they place great importance on numbers. And there appears to be a lot of connection there with the 27 Club. And many researchers think that there's a reason why 27 is so important to them, the 2 and the 7. Maybe it's the 9 that's important when you add the 2 and the 7 together. I think actually Biggie Smalls was 24 when he died, whereas Tupac was 25. I'll have to check on that one myself, but I recall that Biggie was 24. But there's an interesting thing about those two artists, and in my view, it was the murders of Biggie and Tupac that led to the hip-hop game changing forever. When Biggie was killed in March 1997, for me and for many other people that I've spoken to, many other DJs, many other music fans, many other hip-hop heads are in agreement that the hip-hop game just went downhill from 97 onwards. That's when the debasement of the lyrics came in. That's when the production styles changed. That's when any kind of meaningful, uplifting aspect of mainstream hip-hop just went. And it was all about champagne and girls in clubs and gold rims and guns and all the rest of it. And it has been for nearly 20 years. That's been the staple lyrical content of so-called hip-hop in all that time. So I think there's some kind of symbolic relevance to those two artists being taken out. I think in some way it was indicative of the whole business just being led astray and being corrupted in a very systematic way. But both those artists, their deaths were foreshadowed in a very sinister way on a couple of record sleeves that came out a short while before their demise. In the case of Tupac, he had an alter ego known as the Don Columinati. It's Machiavelli. Machiavelli was his artist alter ego, after the Italian scholar and writer Machiavelli, who wrote The Art of War, among many others. And so Tupac adopted this identity, and he put out an album which he titled The Don Columinati. And a short while before this album came out, he'd started speaking in interviews and talking publicly about this shadowy elite organisation known as the Illuminati, which he said controlled the music business and the entertainment business and just about everything else. So he'd started getting that stuff out into the public domain. So he put out this album, and in the sleeve image, it depicts him being crucified. And it was obviously a very shocking and controversial image, similar to the Beatles one that we discussed earlier. And a few months after this, he just happened to get gunned down in a drive-by shooting in Las Vegas, and the perpetrators were never found, we're told. The murder remains unsolved, we're told, despite the fact that it was on the busy strip, surrounded by people, surrounded by eyewitnesses. They just don't seem to be able to catch anyone for it. So that was that. Then 6 months later, after this engineered so-called East Coast West Coast beef between Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. and Suge Knight and Puff Daddy, who were the record label executives behind those two artists, there was this whole sort of to-in and fro-in and public spat and this beef between the East Coast rap artists and the West Coast ones out of Los Angeles that had been getting all the headlines in the music magazines, and there's been this tension brewing and this hostility between the two camps. And then you have Notorious B.I.G. in March 97, 6 months after Tupac, who just happened to meet his fate in exactly the same way, gunned down in a hail of bullets in a car on a busy street in Los Angeles. And that murder just happens to remain unsolved. Can't get anyone for it. Killer's got away scot-free. But interestingly, just before the Biggie murder, he put out an album entitled Life After Death. And this was his second album. The first one was called Ready to Die. Life After Death pictured Biggie in a funeral suit, black suit and a black hat, stood by a hearse, with sort of a grim gothic kind of design on the sleeve and the words Life After Death. And I read an interview recently with the photographer that did the artwork for that shot, and he was saying that they shot a whole bunch of pictures for possible use on that album, and many of them were Biggie up in a mansion by a swimming pool, smoking a cigar and, you know, living the high life up in this mansion. And they just did this one shot of him in a funeral suit by a hearse. And this guy that did the artwork says that Puff Daddy, Sean Combs, whatever you want to call him, who was the executive in charge of the job, picked the funeral hearse shot as the one that should go on the record sleeve, in preference to all these mansion shots. So very interesting that that was the one chosen. And I think it was only a couple of weeks after that album was released, Biggie just happened to die in that way. And so it would appear that both those record sleeves, in a very eerie and unsettling way, foreshadowed what was to come. And people would ask, how can this be? How can there possibly have been any kind of foreknowledge of what was going to happen to these two artists? Well, if the forces behind the manipulation of these artists and the forces that called the shots on those two record sleeves were affiliated with the forces that were responsible for their deaths, then you have the answer as to how there could have been foreknowledge. And this is where we get into the realms of predictive programming, which is, again, a whole different ballgame.
Let me ask you this, Mark. How is all of this affecting, shall we say, let's start with the youth of today. I think we can see how it's affected the ones who were young when, you know, Beatles were out and all of this stuff. And, you know, time goes by. It goes by quickly, quicker than anybody thinks. Somebody at 100 and some odd years old said, seems like life has gone by rather quickly. They're like pushing 117 or something. But that's a true story. But what has been the effect in the past is that, well, we went for it. We got how is it Mr. Ghost put it? Set up big time. My generation got set up big time. But what about the current crop? Say the millennials, the ones in their 20s, and say that from the 20s through the late-ish 30s. Well, what's the effect of all this on them? Is it just business as usual, part and parcel? This is reality. This is our world. They're not paying attention. Or what sense do you get of the effect of this MK stuff on society?
Yeah, well, it's pretty much that, because you've got all these other mind-controlling and dumbing down elements that are going into the mix as well, which I know you've addressed on previous shows. You've got the effects of additives in food and drink, aspartame eating away at brain cells and making people stupid and retarding them. And you've got heavy metal deposits falling from the sky in the form of chemtrails, aluminium, which is linked to dementia, that's being ingested by people. And you've got radiation from various different sources. You've got electromagnetic pollution from Wi-Fi signals and mobile phone masts and microwaves and smart meters for people that are unfortunate enough to be in the vicinity of those. So you've got all these things going into the mix, and they're all designed to cut you off from your true humanity. They're all designed to dumb you down, and they're all designed to keep you separated from any aspects of your higher consciousness. They want you completely locked into this 3D reality, and they want you under the mind control spell that they've devised for you. Because if humanity were to wake up in its mass numbers to what's going on and what's been done to us, and how few there are that are controlling the rest of the population, then it would be game over overnight. I'm sure you've got into these realms before, but when you look into the numbers, we have a situation where thousands, maybe tens of thousands at best, are controlling and manipulating the lives of billions. And the day we all collectively, not just a few of us that are flying the flag for all this, but we all collectively realise that, is the day we take our power back. And they've devised so many ways of preventing us from coming to that realisation. But they ain't going to be able to hold it off forever. You know, they're delaying the inevitable. So what's happening with these artists is just part of the big picture of trying to delay the day when we all wake up and attain that consciousness. And they do it in different ways through the different generations, as you say. In the 1960s, you had the sort of anti-establishment counterculture movement tied in with what was happening with the Vietnam War. You had all those artists coming out of Laurel Canyon. You had the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and you know the agenda that they were down with. These days, they're doing it via Jay-Z and Lady Gaga and Katy Perry and Rihanna and Britney Spears and Miley Cyrus and artists like that. They just kind of update it, give it a bit of a facelift every generation so that it's appealing to a new set of young people. But the agenda is the same at the end of the day when you really get down to it. And they're just trying to keep people stupid and trying to keep people dumb. And they do that with television programs as well, of course. They do it with a lot of the movies that come out of Hollywood, and music just plays its part in that. But a lot of what's being done is basically magic. And you can spell that with or without a K in the Aleister Crowley rendering of the word magic. It's, again, a recognition of the fact that everything in existence is energy vibrating at all these different frequencies. And we live in this energetic construct, which is playing out as the apparent physical reality that we experience. And so they are manipulating the energy by way of these artists and by way of the symbolism that they're putting out there. Because, as I said, the symbols carry energy in themselves. And what people don't realise is that with these magic rituals, because when you get something like the average Grammy Awards show now, or the average VMA Awards show, or the average MTV show, they're all massive occult rituals dressed up as pop music shows. When you really get into the imagery and the symbolism that's put into these things, they're massive occult rituals. And in order for these rituals to have potency and for them to work, it's got to be a two-way affair. It's got to be energy going both ways. And there's this famous phrase, this well-worn phrase, that energy goes where attention flows. And ain't that the truth in terms of what they're doing here? They are requiring the input of the viewers by way of their energetic concentration and attention. And when you're making a connection with one of these shows or with these artists or these hand signs or symbols or whatever, you're giving your attention to it, albeit on a subliminal level, without realising what's going on. And so you have that two-way exchange of energy. And so you're being drawn into whatever agenda the creators have set out for that particular show without realising it's going on. So what do you do about it? You become aware of the tricks that they're using. You become aware of the magician's spell. If you have a TV illusionist like David Blaine or Derren Brown here in the UK, they perform street tricks, street magic, which appears to be just that. You wonder how the hell they've done it. But you realise when you get down to it that it's all illusion and sleight of hand. And sometimes they do shows where they break down how they've achieved a particular illusion. And you can see that it's actually very simple. You just missed it because you were looking in the wrong place. But once they've pointed out to you how they've done it, you're never going to be fooled by that trick again. You also get into subliminal messaging in advertising. And most people have probably seen examples of where you get words and phrases cleverly hidden within images. I mean, there's one which has the word sex hidden in what appears to be a bunch of bushes and trees, And right there in the middle of this image is the word sex, staring right at you in the face. But because of the way the image is designed, and because of the way it appeals to the subliminal mind, you don't notice the word until it's pointed out to you. All it takes is for somebody to say, look there in the middle, starts there, ends there, the word sex. Suddenly you see it. Every time you look at that image again, you're going to see that word straight away. It's never going to have that subliminal effect on you. And so this is the way we stop the effect and break the spell that they're achieving through these music videos and Hollywood movies and all the rest of it. You become aware of it. You take it out of the confines of the subconscious mind into the conscious, where it can be processed and addressed and understood, and there you go. The spell is broken. That's why I keep hammering on about this stuff. That's why so many others do as well. We just need mass numbers of people to understand the mind control illusions that they're under.
We really can't get at the names of the ones who are the true perpetrators of this, can we? Or can we?
We probably could. A proper investigative journalist, I'm sure, could uncover some very interesting, specific names of individuals. I don't really have individuals' names. I just understand that it's going on. I have corporations' names. But there are, of course, individuals that are calling the shots. They have names. They can be identified.
Well, maybe we should go about that. Maybe a collaborative effort next time.
I'll tell you what, one fella that I'd have a few questions for is a record executive by the name of Clive Davis, who worked for many of the big corporations from the 1960s onwards. And famously, he worked with Arista Records in the years when Whitney Houston was discovered and made a big star. And Clive Davis is the guy that decided to go ahead with the Grammy Awards party when the lifeless body of Whitney Houston was lying in a bathtub a few floors above in the same hotel on the night of the Grammy Awards after party in, I think it was 2012. Some very strange, unanswered aspects as to how Whitney Houston came to be in that bathtub unconscious. But very interesting that Clive Davis, the guy that basically discovered her and is credited with having put her on the map, decided to go ahead with a party which was full of celebration and jollity from what we hear, with her body lying directly above in the hotel. That strikes me as a very strange decision to take. Some would say poor taste. Others would suggest that the event was some kind of ritual in itself. And as I say, he's a guy that I'd like to ask that question of.
How about the daughter of Mark?
Yeah. Strange.
Yeah, Yeah,
discovered in exactly the same circumstances as her mother, Whitney Houston, the night before, in the same bathtub, unconscious. Clearly, she survived that one. And then a few years later, as in a few weeks ago, we hear the scenario has been repeated. And she's unconscious in a bathtub again and goes into a coma. Is this coincidence? Is this just one of those things? Am I just a conspiracy
theorist? It's a hell of a coincidence if it is.
It really is. There's a lot of those around, isn't there?
Has she survived this second incident, or is she still in coma, or what?
To be honest, it's something I need to check on, because the last I heard...
I don't know.
Yeah, the last I heard she was in a coma, and they were talking about turning off the life support machines. To be absolutely honest with you, I'm not sure whether that happened. I need to check up on it.
All right, we just sustained this must be an extraordinarily little interview that we're having here, a little controversial conversation, because we seem to be experiencing some really weird stuff. Not only noise on the line, but I just got this notice that there was a hack attack, which has locked up one of my browsers, and that's fine, but I will not be deterred.
Isn't that interesting?
I will find out what happened. Oh, that's very interesting, yeah. This is crazy. Let me just take a peek real quick. All right, now tell us, while I'm looking, tell us about the streaming service that you've mentioned. It seems that Madonna, Miss Burnout, and Jay-Z have partnered to put together some music streaming service for today's hottest artists. They're hot. They're just so hot, hot. Insert bong bubbling noise here. So what about that, man?
Yeah, well, they're hot because we're told they're hot, basically, and too many people just take it that way. You're told Lady Gaga is the next big thing, and so many people just think, oh well, she must be the next big thing because we're told she's going to be. What happened to discernment? What happened to the public deciding who's going to be the next big thing? Deciding which artist they're going to support, rather than being told this artist is great, go out and support them. Shouldn't be happening that way round. But this streaming service, I just think it's a way of getting agenda music out to large numbers of people. It's just a way of getting music which meets the approval of the control system out there. There's two types of music. There's corporate agenda music, which is the music of the kind of artists that we've discussed. And there's music that's made from the heart and soul. And there's music that is made because the artist had something burning inside of them that they wanted to get out. The artist wanted to express themselves creatively, and they put everything into their sound. And for somebody like me, I can tell the difference between those two types of music straight away. I know if I'm listening to an agenda piece of music or a piece of music made because the artist just had to get that message out there. That's just me. That's my discernment. And I feel people need to be more discerning like that and not just swallowing any old BS that they're told is the next big thing, whether it's via this music streaming service or any other source. But I think that's what this is. Stick a couple of familiar celebrated names like Jay-Z and Madonna on it, and so many people that don't spend enough time thinking will just go, oh, this must be great because Jay-Z and Madonna are involved and they're really big. Right. They're celebs.
Yes.
So
good stuff.
Whatever they're putting their name to, I need to have this in my life because it must be great. Otherwise, they wouldn't be involved. That's all it is. That's all it is, I think.
It seems that about 20 hours ago, 20 hours ago, Bobby Christina, Bobby Brown controls life support decision as relatives blame each other, and Nick Gordon. This is from Inquisitor, INQUISTR.com, and it says, what does the future hold for Bobby Christina Brown, the 22-year-old daughter of Bobby Brown, Whitney Houston? That's the question which has remained unanswered since January 31, when she was found unconscious in her home, placed in a medically induced coma, and on life support, with the decision about her future to be determined by Bobby Brown. And he's a real peach, so I think I know what the decision's going to be. And that's that. Oh, yeah, the Illuminati
Bobby.
Mark, we're rapidly losing. Are you getting all that on your end?
Everything sounds fine, my end, mate.
And we're getting all kinds of communication attempt from deep space noises on this end. Well, look, give us your Parthian shot, my good man, and I'll let you get on with your evening. This has been a riveting interview, I must say. It really has. It's very, very disturbing, but good. I like to be disturbed. It yields some good things sometimes.
Well, sometimes that's what it takes to make people sit up and pay attention. And that's what we want them to do. But one aspect of all of this that I just wanted to mention, because it's very key to understanding how we get out of this, is I touched earlier on the concept of predictive programming. And this is where they place depictions of something which they know is coming, some major world event, into a work of fiction. It could be a Hollywood movie, it could be a Simpsons or Family Guy cartoon, some other TV show, some music video. We've seen examples of this time and time again in the years since 9/11, and every time there's a major event, such as the Germanwings plane crash of the other day, or Sandy Hook, or the Boston bombings, or whatever, there are so many vigilant researchers out there now that are on top of their game, that straight away they're able to identify some work of popular culture which has depicted some element of what is to come. And of course this begs the question, why do they do it? What possible benefit is there for them to let us know what they're going to do in advance? And I've spent a lot of time musing over this one, and I've discussed it with a lot of people, and I've listened to the work of a lot of other researchers. And from all of that, what I think it comes down to is the concepts of free will consciousness, consenting and contracting, and also a deep understanding of natural law, which is called many other names. It's known sometimes as universal law, or the law of cause and effect, the law of morality, or consequentialism. Concept is always the same. Every action has a reaction, and there is karmic consequence for the free will choices that we choose in our lives. We are gifted with the capacity to make free will choices, and that's what makes us unique in creation. And with that comes a responsibility. And if you make free will conscious decisions that are immoral and that are harmful to others, then you reap the karmic consequences of it. Now I think they understand this, and I think they understand that we are all bound by these laws, whether we like it or not, whether we believe it or not, and whether we care for it or not. Doesn't make a difference whether you believe it. These laws are in place. They were put there by the creative force behind the universe, and we are required to abide by them or reap the consequences of not doing that. So
Yes.
What we are talking about with the elites, the controllers, is basically mentally ill psychopaths. These people are mentally ill. They are not like the rest of us. The rest of us couldn't do the things they do. We have something called a conscience. We have something called empathy and compassion that would prevent most of us, some exceptions, but most of us from doing the things that they do. So they're psychopaths. That's why they're there. It requires a psychopathic mindset to do the things that these people are doing. Because they're psychopaths, their perception of this force of natural law, consequentialism, cause and effect, whatever you want to call it, is flawed and is twisted, and they seem to think that they can assume a godlike status themselves because they're superior to the rest of us, and that they can somehow cheat and find their way round the karmic consequences that would ordinarily come from doing these harmful things that they do. So, because we have free will consciousness, and because we can use that to consent to certain situations and to contract into certain situations, they feel they've hit upon a way of hijacking that. And they feel that by placing depictions and little clues and little indicators of things that they propose to do in works of popular culture that they know are going to be absorbed by the subliminal mind of large numbers of people, they can escape the karmic consequence of what they've done because they've told us about it. And they've given us the opportunity to object as they see it.
Yeah.
How the hell you're supposed to look at a scene in a Simpsons cartoon and say to yourself, hang on a minute, I know what they're going to do. My God, they're going to kill a bunch of children in an elementary school in Connecticut. I'm not having that. I'm writing to the chief executive of Fox and telling him I'm not having this at all. You know, the very idea that we could object to it in that way or do anything about it is ridiculous. But I still think they believe that by telling us about it in advance, they are letting themselves off the hook because they told us. And we gave it our tacit approval by not objecting and not saying, we do not consent, you can't do this.
You know, Mark, a lot of people aren't aware of that Simpsons thing that happened, and that Sandy Hook thing is a complete fraud, as I see it. Our friend Wolfgang Halbig is all over this, and there's an update on that to follow. But I've seen all of these photographs. I just got some more photographs of the interior of that school. It's not fit to house vermin in, even temporarily. You know, I wonder if whatever is left of God within these psychopaths actually is able to override the psychosis long enough to get them to, as many criminals do, return to the scene of the crime in a subconscious appeal to be caught and rightfully punished. Mark Devlin, you're a treasure. I admire your work very much. His books are Tales from the Flip Side. He's currently writing Musical Truth. His website is markdevlin, devlin.co.uk, and we issue an invitation for you to return to Caravan to Midnight. Come on the bridge, and right after your new book is released. I look forward to it very much.
Yeah, great stuff. Would love to do that. As I mentioned, I'm coming to the US in a couple of days. I'm going to be speaking at the Free Your Mind 3 conference in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia. That's happening this weekend. Loads of great speakers there. There's like 30 names, big names in the truth, alternative, consciousness fields. It's going to be an incredible event. Really looking forward to being a part of that. And work continues on my book, Musical Truth. As you mentioned, I'm looking to get that out early next year and really want to change the game with it. You know, that's the intention. So work will continue on that until it's done.
Well, I hope you're successful in freeing some minds up there, Mark. Good fortune to you, sir. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, sir.
Take care. Mark Devlin. Hey, what do you think about that? The criminal always returns, or almost always returns, to the scene of the crime. In this case, they have decided to take the shortcut. And the shortcut is they just tell you what they're going to do before they do it. It's sort of like leaving a business card at the Christmas tree lot late on Christmas Eve. You leave your card, tell them to call you, and you'll pay them. I did that one time. All right, more than once. And I asked this cop about it. There were cops inside this little restaurant next to the Christmas tree lot and by a house that was built in the 1800s. In Fort Worth, Texas, I knew some hippies that lived there. All sorts of stuff lying around out in the yard that been really old stuff that should have been archived somewhere. But anyway, I asked the cop, I need one of these trees, but there's nobody there. But I'll leave a business card. He said, well, if you leave the business card, that takes the theft element out, doesn't it? I said, well, if you, as a member of the police force, say so, I wonder if that's what's going on with our authorities, our masters, our betters, as they see it. Until next time, exercise caution in your daily affairs. Sharpen those critical thinking skills. Free your mind. Eyes up always. And make ready for what's to come. Crack on.